Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Sullivan. On behalf of everyone at the Alumni Association, I want to welcome you back to campus for a reunion. We're so excited to have you here with us back home again at Notre Dame this weekend. And we're also very grateful and excited that you've joined us here this morning for ND Perspectives. The ND Perspectives series is our signature academic event during reunion weekend. It gives us an opportunity to bring together key members of the Notre Dame family, Notre Dame leaders, who can engage in an in-depth and insightful conversation on a topic of broad interest. And we feel that Notre Dame and the Vatican certainly qualifies as that. We have an amazing group of panelists this morning who will be introduced in a moment. But first, I'm thrilled to introduce to you our moderator, Diane Daniels. Diane serves as the weekend anchor for WSBT 22 News here in South Bend. But throughout her career, she's had stops in South Dakota, Iowa, Michigan, and other places throughout the Midwest. And we're very excited that she's joined us here this morning. Diane's been a great friend to the university over the years. She lives in Granger with her son and her husband, John, who's a 1985 Notre Dame graduate. So please welcome to the stage our moderator and our distinguished panelists.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking time to join us. Our entire panel is going to get seated here, and we have an amazing program for you this morning. And first off, I want to thank Mike for that kind introduction, and certainly thank the university and the Alumni Association for letting me be part of this. I really am not worthy of being up here, but I am so pleased to be able to be part of the conversation. As you know, what we're going to be talking about today is the unique relationship between Notre Dame and the Vatican. And while everyone up here has got a lengthy and distinguished resume, I'm just going to give you a little snippet as a teaser of some of what our panelists will be talking about. John Cavallini, right next to me, is on a commission of theologians from around the world that gets to advise the Vatican, so we'll be picking his brain about that. Next to him, Father Joe Corpora. Father Joe was selected during the Year of Mercy to be a missionary of mercy by Pope Francis, so he has some amazing insight from that experience. The other woman joining me on the stage today, Kathleen Cummings, and she may look familiar to some of you because during the papal visit in 2015, she was everywhere on every major network as a voice from Notre Dame, speaking as an expert on all things papal. So we're going to be talking with her about that. Chuck Lamphere is seated next to Kathleen, and he's prepared an amazing montage of pictures that kind of document the presidents of the university throughout the years and some of their dealings with the Vatican and with the popes throughout time. Last, certainly not least, we have Monsignor Tom Powers, and he actually worked at the Vatican, so he's got the insider's take. And so we're going to be talking with him about that. Also even working to do some vetting of bishops during his time there. So it's an amazing program. We're so glad to have you here. We do want to let you know that we've allowed time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have a question, that's fantastic. We would ask that you hold your questions until the end of the program, and then we will have opportunities for that. And I know that before we got started, there was the recording about making sure your cell phones are off, but if you didn't, please double check because we want to make sure that we don't have any disruptions during this amazing conversation that we're about to have. So first off, John Cavadini, thank you for being here. John is the director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. He's also a professor of theology. And John, you served on the International Theological Commission as a Vatican advisor, and we were talking earlier, probably most people don't know exactly what that even is. So that seems like a good place to start. Tell us what exactly that was and what your role was and what exactly you did.
Sure, thank you, Diane. Okay, so the International Theological Commission is a group of 30 theologians, up to a max of 30 theologians. The group is appointed by the Pope himself, and its advisory to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So it meets in the building of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. And the job of the International Theological Commission is to advise the Holy See, and in particular, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, on different theological questions that the congregation would like advice on. That's the basic nutshell. It was begun in 1969, and it's restruck every 5 years, so you serve a 5-year term. I began in 2009. That was the 9th sitting of the International Theological Commission. What happens is you all gather together. It's presided over by the Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, except for one of the sessions which the Pope presides over himself. And at the first meeting of these 30 theologians, everyone advances, well, the CDF has ideas about what they'd like you to think about. But other theologians have ideas too. It's a very free-flowing discussion. The languages allowed for public discussion are Italian, French, Spanish, German, and English. So you need to be able to work with at least one of those languages and to understand some of the others. But 3 topics are proposed by the prefect, and theologians may have other topics. Then there's a vote, and 3 of those topics are chosen. And then the commission is divided into 3 subcommissions, each with a president, to work on one of those topics. So when I was on the commission, the 3 topics were: what is theology? Catholic social teaching, and the third one was monotheism and violence. The first 2 were eventually written in English, and the third one in French. So the way it works then is each subcommission is charged with writing a document. A president is designated of each subcommission of 10 people. The president of my subcommission, her name was Professor Barbara Hollandsleben from University of Fribourg, one of the 2 women on the council. There were 2 women and 4 lay people. One of the women was a lay woman, and then 3 laymen. Anyway, the lay woman was the president of our council. It might have been the first one ever president of one of these. The commission as a whole then meets yearly at the Vatican in December for a week. You meet from 9 in the morning to 7 at night. There's a break in between, but you're supposed to be working during that break.
Okay.
This is not like an honorific appointment. You
gig,
actually have to work.
Yeah.
And then your subcommission also meets once a year, usually in May. So you have homework in between, writing and research. When the subcommission meets, usually there's part of a document that someone has prepared to be discussed. Then, during the general meeting in December, the drafts of the documents are presented to the whole Theological Commission, and each document is worked over line by line. It's very laborious and painstaking. I have to say the discussion was very free-flowing, even in front of the prefect. There were lots of arguments, polite usually.
Usually.
Mostly. People felt free to voice their opinions, even if they did not agree with the prefect. The process finishes on the last day of the last meeting with a vote which is secret ballot. And the choices are placet, which means it pleases me, or yes, or non placet, which means I hate it, which means no. And we were kind of a speedy bunch. We got 4 documents done. We finished the document on what is theology, and that's been published in 11 languages. under the title in English, Theology Today. The document on monotheism and violence was published in French, but translated in English under the title The Trinity of God and the Unity of the Human Race. And the third document that was published was one on something called the Sensus Fidei, which is a technical theological term for the sense of the faithful on any given topic. But it's a very sort of vague notion. I'm not sure that it's any less vague after this document. But anyway, the document I was working on did not see the light of day. Maybe because I was working on it. Maybe because that one was written in German. And people have a harder time with German, generally speaking, except for the Germans. And so I'm not sure why, but that did not gain a majority approval, though we're hoping to publish it ourselves at some point. So that's kind of how it works. It's kind of fun, but it's a lot of work.
Sounds like a lot of work. For the average Catholic, how, if at all, and maybe this is just really to help the leaders of our church perhaps more than the average churchgoer, how or where would we see the influence of these documents that your Commission of Theologians worked on?
Actually, some of them become very widely influential. Some of them are even famous, believe it or not. Theologians can do something.
For example, I'd love to know more about that.
There was a document, maybe you heard about it. It was in the news about 7 years ago on limbo. And the press was all full of news about how the ITC declared that limbo doesn't exist, which isn't exactly what the document said. But it was a document about the possibility of salvation for the unbaptized babies especially. Sensitive topics, and it did get a lot of press. Then there was also a document published just before, in the session before ours, on natural law. An excellent document, I thought, that's widely read. It's read in classes. So the documents become theological resources for the congregation, but also, since they're published in 11 languages, some of them are more arcane, but some of them have a wider reach, and some of them, as I pointed out, even attract the attention of the press.
Sure. That's fascinating. I know you said that one of the documents you worked on was in the German language, and I know that one of your other connections with the Vatican was you had the opportunity to meet our German Pope, Pope Benedict. In fact, we have a photo of the two of you. Tell us about that meeting, John, and tell us about the document that you created. I think that we have it right here, do we not? Yes. Tell us more about that and that interaction and your connections with the Vatican that way.
So Pope Benedict, when he was Pope, I mean, in the 5 years that I was on it, 4 of the years were Pope Benedict, and then 1 was Pope Francis.
Okay.
But the Pope would always come, the Pope would always give us a little address on each of the topics we were working on in Italian. But I had been interested in the theology of Benedict XVI for a long time. He is one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. He's a brilliant theologian. The fact that he was Pope in some ways obscured the fact that he was also a theologian. Anyway, so we ran a little conference here on the theology of Benedict XVI. And we collected the papers and published them in this form. It happened to be the Pope's 85th birthday, so we decided that we'd present to him these essays as a Festschrift. A Festschrift is a German term which designates a festival collection of essays. Often when you're 65, if your students like you, they collect a collection of essays and put it together, and then they kind of give it to you in some formal way, and then you feel like, wow, I should retire. But
is that why Pope Benedict retired?
No. I don't think so. Okay. Good question. But he was 85 and still going strong at that point.
Right.
So we decided we would present it to him as a Festschrift, and he did receive me one of the times I was over there. And this particular book that you see here was a special edition of this one. It's leather bound. It was very expensive. It's very beautiful. and all the contributors signed it, and John Jenkins, President Jenkins, also signed it. So everyone who had a role in contributing it, and we also presented him one of the normal ones in case he wanted to write in the margins, because that one looks like God produced it directly.
And I think the University of Notre Dame Press
University of Notre
created
Dame
this, right?
Press was so beautiful to work with. They expedited it so we could get it done in time to give it to him for his 85th birthday. And they presented, I could never have imagined such a beautiful volume, but they put it together. So I'm grateful to them.
I would love to know more about this interaction. Like, I know that when one meets with a pope, it is pretty fleeting. You don't get a lot of time, but tell us more about the actual presentation and what that interaction was like.
Well, he was surprised. He didn't know what I was going to do there.
Okay.
I think he was pleasantly surprised.
Good.
See, he looked surprised. And in one of the other pictures where you can actually see the signatures of everybody, he's actually smiling. He thanked me. We talked a little bit. He knows about Notre Dame. He in our little conversations at each of these meetings, he would mention Notre Dame. He'd ask how we were doing. He praised our theology department, and that was kind of nice, since I was chair, at least at the beginning of my time. And it was, I don't know, it was a very satisfying interaction in the sense that I think he was very pleased.
And did this occur during one of your weeks in December when you were there for the commission meetings?
Yes, it did.
Okay, very good.
That's why I tried to get the press to time it for that December. Of course, then he stepped down in February.
John, thank you so much.
You're
and
welcome.
Hopefully some of these folks will be asking questions if they weren't able to hear everything that you had to say during your presentation. So we'll look forward to more questions during the Q&A session. We're going to move on now to Father Joe Corpora. Father Joe was designated as a Missionary of Mercy last year by Pope Francis. And he's also the director of Catholic School Advantage campaign for the ACE program here at Notre Dame. So, Father Joe, thank you for being here. And hopefully everybody will be able to hear Father Joe. So tell us about this selection to be a Missionary of Mercy. I want to start from the start on that. Like, did you get a phone call or a letter, or how did that work? And then take us through the process of that.
Thanks a lot. If you can't hear me, I'll try my best, but a lot of people don't want to hear me, so they can move to that side. And that'd be, everybody will be happy.
So go sit over there if you don't want to hear Father Joe.
Yeah, you know, in the Pope's letter on the Year of Mercy, he wrote that he wanted to send missionaries out who would proclaim the mercy of God in as many ways as possible. And only a month ago did I learn how it actually happened, long after the fact.
Okay.
One day in December, I got an email on my cell phone. I was in Monterrey, Mexico on an ACE project, and I got an email, and I didn't recognize the return address, Carmela Marcone. And I'm thinking, this is like some lost relative that if I just send $5,000, I'll be able to get her passport back. She'll be fine.
Yeah.
And I was about to delete it, but I did open it up, and it said, Reverend and Dear Father. And then it was about having been appointed as a Missionary of Mercy by the Pope. I just cried because I was so moved by it. Actually, the letter, I was hitting the phone and trying to get to open the letter. You know how that is on a little cell phone.
Right.
Anyway, I read the letter. I only learned, maybe a month ago, that it was Cardinal Tobin who submitted my name to the Vatican. I did not know who it was. Because when I called Bishop Rhodes, he was so excited and glad, but he said, but I didn't do it. So I had no idea who had submitted my name. So that's how my name got there, and then you get this little email saying you've been appointed as Missionary of Mercy.
So for those of us who don't know exactly what it means to be a Missionary of Mercy, explain that, please.
Well, I'm in that same category.
Okay.
But what I think that for a long time the church has had missionaries of harsh judgment. And so I think the Pope wanted to offset that by making Missionaries of Mercy. Really, I think it was an attempt on the part of the Pope to, well, first of all, I think the Holy Spirit gave the Pope a special grace to inaugurate the Year of Mercy. We've had a lot of years, year of family life, year of consecrated life, year of faith, and they've all been good years, but quite frankly, they kind of peter out after they start.
Okay.
The Year of Mercy just kept growing and growing and growing to the point where nobody wanted it to end. And so I just think the Holy Spirit gave the Pope this grace, and then, so there are many different parts of the Year of Mercy, but I think in an attempt to have people more fully be open and receptive to the mercy of God, that the mercy of God is always available, always accessible, always there for us. He appointed 1,000 missionaries around the world who would, in his name, preach, hear confessions as often as possible. In the letter that you get, it says, you're asked to suspend your normal pastoral duties for 1 year. I'm like, you don't know Father Scully. He's my boss. I'm not going to suspend my normal pastoral duties for a year. But it was just a request to extend in whatever ways a person could the mercy of God to as many people as possible. So that's what I did.
So we have a picture up here where I think you and some of the other Missionary of Mercies are in Rome, and you're meeting with Pope Francis there. Tell us, was this your first meeting ever with Pope Francis?
No, I had met him once before, really just shaken his hand and not had a chance to speak to him. In this one, I was able to talk to him for like 90 seconds.
What did you say?
I thanked him for sending me as a missionary of mercy. This was on the day the Year of Mercy closed. It was in the Vatican when they had the closing mass of the Year of Mercy, when he closed the door. I did try to get behind the door to hold it so he couldn't close it.
Put a door stop
but didn't
in there.
work.
Okay.
And anyway, it's too long of a story how I actually positioned myself to get in the front line so that I could meet the Holy Father. But I kind of figured out what was going to happen. And anyway, yeah, I thanked him and he thanked me, and then he said to me, it's not over yet. And I didn't know what he meant by that, but then that day he published his end of the year exhortation of the Year of Mercy and asked the Missionaries of Mercy to continue in that role. Mm-hmm. And I told him I love him, and I just hugged him because I didn't even know if you're supposed to or not. I mean, what do they call it?
Like the Secret
Service are all over looking at everything. But you know, when you just love someone, you hug them. What else do you do?
Right.
And so I just lunged out and hugged him. And it was, and you know, he thanked me for the service, and I think that was about it.
Okay. Okay.
But it's a moment I won't forget. And you know, I love him not only because he's the Pope, but because of who he is as a person. It has greatly influenced my life. He's the Pope I've been praying for my entire life, but didn't know it.
Okay. Until it happened.
And
then you realized that your
right.
prayer was answered.
Right.
Very good. Now, is it true that as a missionary of mercy that you were allowed to hear confessions that typically only higher people in the church can hear? Is that accurate?
There are certain sins that are reserved to the Holy See, and the Holy Father extended to the Missionaries of Mercy the authority to forgive those sins, now indefinitely, because he asked us to continue, but it was during the Year of Mercy.
Great. Do you feel like that brought people back to confession?
Total. Well, just Pope in his person has brought people back to the church. And, you know, I remember hearing a confession one time, and I sat down, and the person said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 62 years since my last confession. These are my sins." And I wasn't even 62 at the time. I was 61. I just couldn't believe it. So, yes. But I think it's brought people back to confession because everybody needs the mercy of God. No one can get by without it. It will save us all. And the more it got going, people just thought about it and said, I want to open myself to this mercy. So yes, I think it. And that wasn't the only one. That was the longest, but there were plenty of 30s and 40 years. Yeah.
That's got to feel great. You're fulfilling the mission when you hear that.
Yeah, it's humbling more than great, to be perfectly honest with you. And I always think that somewhere in heaven, God mixed up wires, and he was supposed to ask Ernest, but somehow I got asked because I'm just a sinner like everybody else. So, but it's been great. It's been a tremendous blessing and grace in my life.
Father Joe kept a blog for at least part of your time while you were on one of your pilgrimages as a missionary of mercy, and you can get to it through the Notre Dame website. I would absolutely encourage you to go and read that because I thoroughly enjoyed reading that. It really captured the essence of the enthusiasm, the excitement, and I loved reading about when you blogged about food, the food over there.
I always say, of course, the next priest to die of hunger will be the first one, so I'm not worried. And if I can do a teeny infomercial.
Absolutely.
That blog became a book.
Oh,
that was
wow.
published in April.
That's great.
I didn't even intend to do that. Notre Dame magazine said, would you be willing to write an article every so often for our web page? And so I did. And then Corby Books asked me if I would make it into a book.
Great.
It's called The Relentless Mercy of God.
Now, as I alluded to before, Kathleen Cummings may be a familiar face to many of you because she became a papal expert all over the TV in 2015 during Pope Francis's visit to the United States. She's also an associate professor of American Studies and director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. So my first question for you, Kathleen, is how does one become a papal expert and get that gig on TV? I need to know more about this. I'm not after your job, by the way. I don't have the credentials.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great story, and especially a great story to share on Alumni Weekend here at Notre Dame. Because when Pope Benedict resigned in February of 2013, you may remember everyone was shocked. There were many people who were commenting about the significance, trying to put it in context. And a graduate of one of the first classes of women here at Notre Dame, Ann Thompson, who's a correspondent for NBC, noticed that most of the commentators on TV were men. And she thought, I'd love to find a woman who could speak about the Catholic Church and the history of the Catholic Church. And she called one of her friends from her Notre Dame class, a woman named Sheila O'Brien. And of course, nobody had ever heard of me. I mean, I was a historian here teaching. I could occasionally would do quotes for newspapers and things. And I had worked with Sheila because one of my areas of expertise is on the history of Catholic sisters. And when Catholic sisters were in the news quite a bit, around 2009, I had worked with Sheila on that. And Sheila said to Anne, you've got to meet Professor Cummings. So I started to do some clips speaking about the resignation and speaking about the history of the papacy, and particularly as it affected or might affect Catholics in the United States, which is I'm a historian of the United States. And they would put me on nightly news, and it was all very fun for 5 weeks. And I'll never forget, so then they asked me, NBC asked me to be live for the conclave when the announcement, they said, when you see white smoke, please go directly to our affiliate here, WNDU, which I did, and it was Brian Williams and Ann Thompson and me, so it was a great moment for Notre Dame, as Brian actually said, running up the score for Notre Dame, we're going to turn now to Professor Cummings.
All right.
Well, in any case, I walked out of the studio that day thinking, this has been a blast, but my TV career is over because we have a new pope, and there's no more story here, and I was certainly wrong. Pope Francis kept making the news, and eventually I even went to New York City a couple times to do live coverage from 30 Rock, and the longest I was there was during the papal visit in 2015.
So tell us more about that. Well, first off, how close were you able to get to the action, or were you just kind of like at a news desk somewhere providing commentary? Because that must have been an amazing experience and opportunity.
It certainly was. Unlike my panelists, I have not met Pope Francis, but I've spent an awful lot of time looking at him through a TV monitor. Mm-hmm. I was mostly in the studio. When he went to Philadelphia, I also went to Philadelphia, and I was doing live coverage there. But so I saw him drive by in his Pope-mobile. But mostly, I was interpreting what was happening for a larger audience. So I didn't get to meet him in person, but it was a lot of fun.
So that must have been amazing to know. I mean, because viewership for the Pope, you can't get better ratings than that, people, let me tell you. So the millions upon millions of people who were fortunate enough to see your commentary, that must have been very satisfying for you, Kathleen. And What about beyond 2015? Have you been able to continue on in that role as the Pope continues to make news and certainly the Church continues to make news?
Absolutely, and you know, I really do see it as just an extension of what I do here at Notre Dame. It's just an opportunity to expand my classroom, as you say. I'm looking at this clip from the Today Show, and mostly thinking about how much I miss the makeup artists at 30 Rock. Thank you. He just said I don't need them. No, but I'll tell you, that moment was one of my favorites. I remember this very well because I had spent, this was the second day of the visit, and I had done live coverage of the canonization of Junipero Serra, which you'll remember was in Washington, D.C., and it was a bit controversial. And I'm actually writing a book on canonization, and I had done quite a bit of archival research on Serra's cause in particular. So one of the challenges as a professor, you know, it's an occupational hazard of ours that we tend to go on too long, and you just can't do that on TV, right? It was a subject that I knew an awful lot about, and I was trying to not dumb it down at all, but to render it in a way that could be easily accessible. So that was about a 2.5-hour live coverage of that, and I was a bit tired, and then they said, you know, TV moves, it all moves so quickly. They said, the Today Show needs you for an interview, and I said, okay. So I went, and they said, now this interview is about Monsignor Mark Miles. And I said, this is going to be a very short interview because I have no idea who you're talking about. And it turned out Monsignor Mark Miles was the translator. If you recall from the visit, there was a kind of short guy following the Pope around everywhere. He made the news because he looks an awful lot like Stephen Colbert. And there was, so today, hopped onto this and they said, can you talk about him? And I said, well, I don't know him. I never. So they said, well, just think about what his job would be like. So actually, it was knowing Pope Francis and having spent so much time observing him and thinking about him, I was able to realize that even though I didn't know Mark Miles at all, that for someone like Pope Francis, who, as he admitted, was not as comfortable in English, he could understand, and for a Pope who loves to be close to the people. And so an interpreter that week, what an interesting job to be able to facilitate that closeness between the Pope and the people he met, but not interfere with that, to be in the background and in the shadows. So that all went well. This clip, I later found out, was watched by 8 million people, and I thought, well, there you go. I just, in front of 8 million people, taught something on a subject I knew nothing about. And, but again, it's not that different from what we do as professors. There are times when there are times when you know an awful lot about a subject and you have to translate it in a way that is accessible, and then there are times when students ask you questions that you might not know the answer to, but you think about what you do know and how you can render that. So I just thought it was all, I just had a great time.
Have you been able to do much of that since then, since that time?
Well, it was funny. After this, this was 8 days that I was in Philadelphia, New York, and NBC did ask me if I had any plans to move to New York. And I said, no, I love my job here. I love South Bend. So it's not my real job, and so I am able to do pieces here and there from our local affiliate. But I don't have the kind of, South Bend's not the easiest place to get to. So for something like the papal visit, where there was time to plan and I could get there, I was also in New York for the canonization of the 2 popes in April 2014. So things that there's time to plan and then I can do that. I'd love to continue doing that, but my main job is being right here in South Bend.
Sure. But actually, you're getting ready to go to Rome tomorrow, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Tell us about that.
This is much less glamorous. What I usually do in Rome is go to the Vatican Secret Archives, which I can tell you is nothing like you may have read about in a Dan Brown novel. It's really, really boring. There is a moment where you show your Vatican ID, Secret Archives ID to the Swiss guards, and you say in your best Italian, I'm going to the archives, and it's a little bit glamorous, but once you get there, it's just pretty boring. You have these big documents that you spend hours poring over. But I also, to relate it back to the panel's topic, Notre Dame's new building in Rome, the Rome Global Gateway, is a place where we're just doing all sorts of amazing work and connecting with Italian-based scholars. So I'll be having a conference there run by the center that I direct, the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, on using archival sources at the Vatican and in other repositories in Rome to better understand Catholicism in North America, so how those sources can help us. So that's the other part of my job, but no makeup artist for that. I just look just like myself.
Well, we hope you have a wonderful trip. I'm sure our audience will have more questions. I'm going to have you pass the baton, as it will, to Chuck Lamphere. Now, Chuck is the Director of Church Affairs in Father Bill Leese's office, and he is very well-versed in all things Notre Dame as they relate to the Vatican. In fact, for purposes of this presentation, he's got his own clicker to run through pictures. So that in and of itself is impressive. So Chuck, if you can just start, I think we've already got your first slide queued up here.
We sure do. I thought I'd bring some visual aids because surely you don't want to look at me for the next 10 minutes. I've got really the best job at Notre Dame, I think, because I, along with my colleagues, attend to the university's relationship with the church, including with the Holy See. And my job is easy because we have an incredible legacy of productive relationship with the Vatican, with the church all over the world. And that's in no small part to the outstanding work of the Congregation of Holy Cross, founded by Basil Moreau and represented here by Father Corpora. Also by our outstanding faculty like Professor Cavallini and Professor Cummings, and our great alumni, you all included in Monsignor Powers, who will speak after me. But let me just take you a little bit down Notre Dame memory lane for just a few minutes. This is a great picture of right outside this building, Father Soren on his 50th anniversary of being a priest. This was just a few decades after Notre Dame was founded. And Notre Dame and he had really become almost at the center of the American Catholic Church. These are bishops from all over the country coming to celebrate Father Soren's 50th anniversary. He's seated next to Cardinal Gibbons, the Archbishop of Baltimore. The Vatican didn't have a permanent formal representative to the United States at the time. So in fact, it was, in de facto, it was Cardinal Gibbons. So right from there and even before, Notre Dame was building this relationship with the Vatican and with the popes. Right here on this stage in 1936, I think, the highest ranking Vatican official ever to come to Notre Dame was Cardinal Pacelli. He was the Secretary of State, essentially the Pope's right-hand man, the Pope's number 2. He came here and received an honorary degree from Father O'Hara, the then president of Notre Dame. Now you'll see a pattern as I go through these slides that you come to Notre Dame and then you become Pope. So I don't know what that means exactly, but Cardinal Pacelli became Pope Pius XII, and Father Hesburgh, who worked with so many popes and so many presidents, was appointed by the Vatican during that time to be the Holy See's representative to the International Atomic Energy Commission. A priest, a theologian, brought a really important and valuable voice to that conversation about atomic energy, atomic weapons, and there he is with Pope Pius XII. He served in the same capacity with John the 23rd, St. Pope John the 23rd, and the International Atomic Commission. This is a great story, a great picture. This is the 1960 Notre Dame commencement. The commencement speaker was a fellow by the name of Dwight David Eisenhower, who was president of the United States at the time. And toward the far left of the picture is a then fairly unknown in the United States at least, Cardinal of Milan named Cardinal Montini. I've got to tell a couple of just two great stories about this visit. So Hesburgh spoke Italian and Montini spoke Italian. Montini didn't speak any English, and so they were wandering around campus, showing him the campus. And Father Ted brought the cardinal to this big hole in the ground that was to become the Hesburgh Library. And Hesburgh said it's going to be 14 stories tall, and it's going to have this many volumes. It's going to be the largest library in American Catholic higher education. It's going to be a remarkable building. And the cardinal said, well, that's wonderful, Father Hesburgh. How did you raise the money? And Hesburgh said, oh, we haven't raised the money. And Montini looked aghast at him and said, how could you possibly begin this incredible construction project without having the funds in hand? And Hesburgh looked at him and said, Cardinal, you have to have faith. So that's one funny story, a true story. I'll tell you another story which is a little less funny but still very important for Notre Dame. So Monsignor was impressed by what we had going on here at Notre Dame. He also had just lived through the Second World War and saw the destruction throughout Europe. And as the Archbishop of Milan, he was the chancellor of what I think is fair to say is one of the most important libraries in the world, the Ambrosiana Library. A remarkable library, second maybe only to the Vatican Library itself, and Monsignor was afraid that another war would occur and that library would be destroyed, as so many libraries in Europe and other treasures of Europe were destroyed. And so he asked Father Ted if the University of Notre Dame would be willing to microfilm the most precious materials in the Ambrosiana Library. And we already had a strong medieval institute at the time, but this was a moment where the university's Catholic mission allowed us to take advantage of these great treasures in the relationship with the church and really strengthen Notre Dame as a great academic institution. And I'll come back to that theme in a moment. So here's the theme again. You come to Notre Dame and you become Pope. Monsignor became Pope Paul VI and developed a real personal, friendly relationship with Father Ted, and it was reciprocated on Father Ted's behalf. They created some really wonderful things I hope I have a chance to talk about in a moment. Monk Malloy, Father Malloy, who was president here for 18 years, had a wonderful relationship with the Holy See. He served on the Vatican's office for non-believers, is what it was called at the time. Now it's called the Pontifical Council for Culture, and was very involved in the implementation of St. Pope John Paul II's important encyclical Ex Cordea Ecclesia on higher education. And of course, Father Jenkins interacted a bit with Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict was offered a job here at Notre Dame when he was a young theologian, and he demurred because he said his German or his English wasn't good enough. I wonder what he could have accomplished if he had taken that job. And finally, a couple of years ago, Pope Francis received the university's leadership and the Board of Trustees and delivered a really important address about the importance of Catholic higher education, and it was a great honor for the university to interact with Pope Francis. And Father John interacts with numerous Vatican offices, and I'm privileged to help a bit with that.
Wow, those pictures are amazing, and the stories behind them even more so, Chuck. You mentioned the Vatican Library, and I would love to hear more about the unique relationship that Notre Dame has with the Vatican Library and kind of the unprecedented access that people with Notre Dame affiliations have if they want to use that library.
Well, thank you. The Vatican Library really is probably the finest library in the world, at least for certain things that if you want to study. If you want to study anything from the medieval era or the Renaissance, it's really without peer. It's called the attic of civilization. 90% of the materials in the Vatican Library have not been looked at in over 100 years. The catalogs of the Vatican Library are not that great. The Vatican librarian would tell you that. There's a catalog that says this book is about 14th century German saints. Well, that doesn't tell you much. So it's a treasure trove for scholars and for students. The Vatican librarian and Father Jenkins have a very good friendship. I'd go so far as to call it a friendship. And the Vatican librarian wants those materials used and seen by scholars. And so the university has entered into an agreement with the Vatican Library where Notre Dame faculty and students have a lot of special access. The Vatican Library tends not to let in graduate students, but our graduate students are able to access those materials. We host all manner of special programs. In a few months, we'll be having a special program in the Vatican Library on paleography, the study of medieval and Renaissance handwriting, which is a very important thing for our medieval institute and other parts of the university. And this is, we have this relationship because Notre Dame is a great university. If we weren't a great university with terrific faculty and terrific students, the Vatican Library would have worked with somebody else. But it's also because of our Catholic character. They could have worked with Yale, they could have worked with Harvard, but I think they invited Notre Dame into this partnership because Notre Dame's a place where faith seeks understanding. and our faculty and our students and our administration take our relationship with the church very seriously. So it's really a treasure, and because I'm competitive, it's a really wonderful competitive advantage too in the academic space.
Chuck, thank you so much. I'm going to see if you're willing to share that microphone with Monsignor.
I'm willing.
Powers, all right, very good. Thank you for being so patient, Monsignor. This is Monsignor Tom Powers. He's the Vicar General of the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he's a former official of the Congregation of Bishops in Vatican City. Lots of experience working at the Vatican, and he's going to be able to share some of that with us today. So first off, how did you get from here to there is my first question, Monsignor.
I have no idea. I never asked. I never said. I remember January 1st, 2005, my bishop called me and said he had something very important to tell me. I thought, oh, brother, what did I do now? And he said that John Paul II had called me over to work in the Congregation for Bishops, which is a very important office that helps the popes with the nomination of bishops around the world. I said, Bishop, there are 1,000 men more qualified and more interested in this job. He said, that's why they want you, because you're not interested, which was true. I had never thought I'd be over there. And I was there 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, worked for Pope John Paul died before I arrived, so I thought the whole thing might be called off, but it wasn't. So I worked for Pope Benedict and for Pope Francis until about a year and a half ago. A great experience, and I learned a great deal about the church, about faith, and an inspiring place. I was scared going to the Vatican because here I am a parish priest, and some of the cynical people said, well, you better don't lose your faith over there, and what's it going to be like? And I had no idea why I was going over there. But I can tell you, after 10 years, my faith increased. The way the Holy Spirit guides and works in the church is really remarkable and inspiring. So it was a good experience for me.
So the process of vetting bishops is certainly no small task, I'm sure. What can you share without, I guess, giving away corporate secrets that that would be interesting for our audience to know about that process that you participated in?
Right, so when you start working in any office in the Vatican, especially where I worked, you take a promise to keep the pontifical secret. So all the vetting, so to speak, the studying, the examination of candidates for the episcopacy is all under pontifical secret. And that's not because it's just secret and we're hiding things, but because it allows the person who's responding to a letter, a questionnaire, a 12-point questionnaire about the candidate, can write honestly and openly, knowing that only about 3 people are going to see this letter. It also protects the man being examined. So if someone says to Father Joe, hey, Joe, I got a letter about you about being a bishop. Oh, really? And then 2 years pass, 5 years pass, 10 years pass, and you're never asked to be a bishop. You'll think your whole life, wonder what happened. What did they say about me? So the pontifical secret is really to protect the process and help to really get honest answers about the men. And I will say this, and I didn't know a thing about the process before I went over there, but it is a good process in canon law, and everyone is involved. It's not an old boys club. It is not a few people just picking whom they like. Lay men, lay women, religious sisters, DREs at parish levels are all involved in this process who answer letters about a candidate under pontifical secret. And so everybody in the church is involved in this process.
So what was your typical day like there? I mean, I'm envisioning you're walking down the hall and the Pope's walking down the hall, and but I'm sure that it wasn't probably as casual as that. But explain for us, I guess, how close on any given day you were to the Pope and the inner workings of the Vatican.
We'd see the Holy Father a lot. So our offices were, most of the congregations, there are 9 congregations in the Vatican, and most of the offices are outside the piazza right there. If you've ever seen or been or seen photographs, we're right outside the piazza. The Holy Father, of course, is inside the Papal Palace and inside the Vatican, so we're a little bit outside. So you don't see the Pope walking through the halls every day. But I will say, I mean, it is not like Godfather 3 where there's dark corners and people whispering, how do we make people's lives miserable? And it's really a wonderful place. We work with laymen, lay women, there's ushers there, and it's a happy environment. We did things together. We prayed together. We'd have dinners and meals together. So it is a wonderful place, like any other place you'd work. But it's just men and women dedicated to the mission of the church. And our one role was to help the Holy Father with his Petri ministry in the world, and that's what we were there to do. And it was, again, a great experience for me.
And you were there when the Notre Dame Board of Trustees came to visit and had a private papal audience, and I think perhaps you helped facilitate that. Tell us a little bit about that.
I did, and I was very proud. What people don't know, and what I'm proud of, what all of us should be proud of, is that when I worked in the Vatican, in the 10 years I worked there, there were 5 alumni priests from Notre Dame who worked in the Vatican. No other school can boast of that, and they were all great guys. So we'd get together and have Notre Dame dinners, but nobody in the Vatican, no other school can say they had that many alumni working in the Vatican in that span of time. So we were very proud when Notre Dame came over, Father Jenkins and the board, and they saw the Holy Father, had lunches and meetings, and it was a very, very good moment for Notre Dame, and I think for the Vatican, for that relation and for that common goal of the faith.
You had somebody to watch football games with then.
I did. Now, of course, we're 6 hours ahead, so we had to stay up really late to watch the games, and it wasn't worth it often. But we did miss some of the games because of the time change. But again, Notre Dame has a great presence over there still, and we're very proud of that.
Now, I'm told that there is apparently a Dillon Alumni Hall rivalry that has made its way from campus to the Vatican.
Yes, so before I left, my colleague in the Congregation for Bishops is from Alumni Hall. I'm from Dillon Hall. So it's kind of like that's right. And Dillon's, that's probably why I got the job, because I was in Dillon Hall. But so it was kind of like the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner checking into work. So we got along at the work, and then we continued our rivalry after work. A great guy, Monsignor John Syack, and he's from Alumni, I'm Dillon. But we worked very well together, and as did all the Notre Dame people there.
So, a little bit about just, it must really be a badge of honor in that environment to be able to say you're from the University of Notre Dame. And I'm guessing even people who've never set foot on American soil understand that over there. Am I
That's right,
getting
yes.
that right?
That's correct, yes, yeah. They recognize the university, and it's well known, and it's recognized as a beacon of faith, not only in this country, but around the world, and especially in Rome now with all of the new buildings and new projects there in Rome. But I think also the alumni working in the Vatican was a big presence that really got the name of the university also recognized among the non-Americans who maybe had not heard of Notre Dame before.
Sure. Do you miss it?
I miss the rhythm. So we worked, somebody asked Pope John the 23rd one time, how many people work in the Vatican? He said, about half. And so that was not my experience. We worked very hard, but in Italy, there was a great rhythm. So it was very paper intensive. We had internet, but we never used internet for the work that I did, ever. There were very few phone calls, very few meetings. We worked hard, but there was a rhythm to it. It's interesting at how Rome, they had this process of, so I had no secretarial staff. I did everything. I cleaned the jams out of the copier and changed paper and made all the copies. And they have bella and bozza. And so bozza is the draft form. So I would work on the bozza, the draft form, put it up to my superior every day. They'd look at it, make any changes, come back to me. I'd make the changes, and then print it out in bella, which is the beautiful form, on the letterhead. And then it goes back up, and then it comes back signed. So a letter could take 3 days. For an American, that was tough. But after a while, I realized it was very thoughtful and deliberative. My friend would say, no, it's just slow. But it really was not. It was very thoughtful. And there were times when, with that thoughtfulness, there may be one night I'd go home and say, let me think about that a little bit more, and you come in the next day and kind of change your mind. So I do feel the change here in my current role. It seems a little more frantic and a lot more quick-paced, where in Rome it was very slow, thoughtful, and methodical in how we worked, which I thought was very helpful, actually.
Right. Did you have a cell phone over there?
I did not have a smartphone. I had a cell phone. What's funny was, because I'm not a very technological guy, so there was a nun I worked with in my office, and she kept upgrading, and when she upgraded, she gave me her last cell phone because mine was not very nice. But I had no smartphone. And what's interesting, too, in the Vatican is the way it works. We had no keys to the office. My first day there, I thought, do I get keys? Oh, no, you don't get keys. And so which is actually, again, as an American, I thought, that's silly. But as time went on, I realized it's better not to have keys to this sensitive stuff. And also, when the day is over, you go home. You can't bring work home, so it's very healthy. So I'd be at my office every day, and the lights would start going off. The ushers are turning lights off, and I have to leave. That's it. If you don't leave, you're going to be sleeping in the Congregation for Bishops overnight. Again, so all these things I learned that were very helpful, I thought, the way the Vatican works. A lot of work is done. It's hard work, but the way it's done is very, again, thoughtful, and I appreciate that very much.
Very good. Monsignor, thank you so much. We're now at the point in our program where we would love to welcome your questions for our panelists. And So I would encourage you, there are microphones right here if you want to approach the stage, and if we've got anybody in the balcony, we've got folks up there who can facilitate getting a microphone to you, but we would love to take some audience questions, and because we're having mic issues, please let us know who your question is for, and we'll probably pass the mic down to that individual. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I actually have a quick story for Father Joe and Monsignor Tom. It parallels the things that you talked about. I'm an archdiocesan priest for Portland, Oregon, and I'm class of 82 and 97. But now that you mentioned the existence of those letters, I guess we can at least say that they exist. So I got one of those letters once as a questionnaire for someone. But like Father Joe, with the email, when I got this letter, there was no return address, and the font of my address looked like something religious or spiritual. I thought, this is just some religious organization fundraising, and I don't have time for this, so I didn't even open it, I just put it aside. And then 6-7 weeks later, I was going through my piles of paper in my office and came across this letter, and I almost just threw it into the recycling. I said, well, at this point, I don't care. I was almost recycled it. But I thought, no. So I opened it up, and sure enough, it was from the Papal Nuncio's office for America, the priest who represents the Vatican to the United States, and it was one of these letters. But it was past the deadline, and I'm thinking, I'm a nobody. Who cares what I think about, So I didn't do anything about it. And I'm sharing this besides amusing the two of you, because the overlap, to let us all know how seriously the church takes this process. Is that I'm just a nobody diocesan priest in Portland, Oregon, and about 2 weeks after I almost threw it out, secretary gets on the line and says, Father, there's some priest with an accent who wants to talk to you. And I'm wondering, who is this? And it turns out it was the executive director, executive assistant from the Papal Nuncio's office saying, Father Wood, we noticed you haven't returned your questionnaire yet. And I think you gotta be kidding me, So number one, I was chagrined, but I was impressed with certainly the work you would have been involved in of how seriously the church does take this process.
Actually, I called you. I just faked the accent.
Okay, gotcha, okay. But it was interesting that just like Father Joe, I almost thought it was, sort of religious junk mail and almost threw it out. But it is a blessing as a Notre Dame alumnus and a priest for the church to see how our university is so integrally involved in the work of the church here and globally. So thank all of you for your comments.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That was... So, folks, don't be shy. Come on down. If you have questions for our panelists, we would love to have you get the chance to engage with them. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Mary Carol Murphy. I'm Tom Power's cousin, and we were classmates together. And I was wondering if you could tell a quick story about being the voice of Christmas Eve Mass to the English-speaking world.
Mary asked it perfectly. Thank you. Cardinal Foley did the voice of Midnight Mass from the Vatican at NBC for years, and he retired of that in 2009, and he asked me to consider that, and NBC did a little interview, and so, like Kathleen, I did the voice of Christmas Midnight Mass from the Vatican until 2015. And it was I thought, what am I doing? This is not my experience. I was a nervous wreck, and the first year I did it was the year that poor Pope Benedict got pulled down by that woman, if you remember that. So I thought, get up, because you're on, and I didn't know what I was doing, but it was a great experience. My family, of course, as all families, Mary knows my family well, she's my cousin. I called the next day, because after doing this broadcast, and they all watched it on NBC, and I said, what do you think? And all my little nieces and nephews and mom and dad, everybody together, as only a loving family can say, is bring back Foley, bring back Foley. But yeah, that was a good experience, Kathleen. As you know, you're watching up from the balcony in St. Peter's, watching the events go on, and it's inspiring to know that millions are listening as you're talking about what's happening at the Mass and not speak too much, but really to let the Mass speak for itself. And that was a great honor for me, and I do miss that because it was a good experience.
Well, I'd say let's not bring back Foley. We're glad that you did that. Other questions, folks? Please don't be shy. Come on down. We'd love to hear from you.
Father Joe, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to your experience as a missionary of mercy here on campus in the past year. What was it like with the student body, or how was it received, or what did it look like?
Thanks a lot. I guess I would say 2 or 3 things. I was asked to give lots and lots and lots of talks, which I was happy to do because each time I spoke about the mercy of God, I believed it even more. So that's one thing I did a lot. And I was able to hear a lot of confessions, both in the Basilica, in my office, in my room in Dillon Hall, and a lot of one-on-one appointments with people who wanted to ask a specific kind of question about something. So yeah, that's how it was here. Yeah, that would be the answer to that question.
Did you find that students sought you out in that role perhaps more than any other year that students would seek you out for something like that?
I think they did because I'm so cute. That's what I think was the real reason. I don't know how to answer. Maybe yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I found a lot of other people also sought me out. There was a little misconception, for example, that because of this role, I could make irregular marriages regular. And so there was some misunderstanding at first. I've been getting a lot of phone calls and then just realized that wasn't what
wasn't
I
on
did.
your pay grade there.
It was not,
yeah.
no.
Okay.
Not yet.
Right, okay. All right. Very good, very good. More questions, folks. Please approach the microphone. We'd love to hear from you.
Father, I wasn't aware that certain sins, certain type priests could give certain sins and not. Could you elaborate on that? You had mentioned that you could forgive certain sins that you couldn't before.
Do you want to know what those are?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
What's the list?
Well, there are 4 that the Pope, it's all in Latin. I thought it was a big ad for Chick-fil-A, but when somebody did translate the Latin, I figured the 4 sins that at least are reserved to the Holy See, that the Holy Father gave to the missionaries the authority to forgive would be, 1 would be an attempt on the life of the Pope. 2 would be breaking the seal of the confessional. 3 is desecration of the Eucharist. And 4 is that the priest would forgive in the confessional his own sexual partner. Now, what else do you want to know? So yeah, those are the 4 sins that were the authority to forgive those. Because I think by committing those sins, you're excommunicated from the church. That's why you would be. Now, anybody up here who knows theology more than I do can correct me, but that's why they're reserved to the Holy See, and then that authority was given to the missionaries to forgive.
I don't know more theology than you, but I can say that throughout, they're very historically conditioned. So, for example, I teach about the history of Catholics in the United States, and in the late 19th century, in many dioceses, there was a massive commitment to parochial schools. And so in the Archdiocese of Detroit, for example, in 1880, the Bishop of Detroit declared it a reserved sin for Catholic parents to send their children to public schools. Very difficult to enforce, and it was later the Vatican said you can't do that. But it is, and it was interesting to me because I use this when I teach in the ACE program, the Alliance for Catholic Education. I used to say, does anybody know what a reserved sin is? And of course nobody would know. Now it's back in the parlance of the day we're talking about it. So I think there are times, and I don't know the extent to which the bishops have the authority to declare a reserved sin, but they have done so, and they've done so in the United States.
And I think the ones from the Holy See have been long-standing. I didn't know I thought a reserved sin was something you had to call to make reservations for and then do it. But that's not what it was. You don't learn these things in the seminary.
I think, sir, hang with us. We'll get to your question. Thank you.
Just
Go
one
ahead,
thought, if I
Monsignor.
could. I was there, of course, when Pope Benedict resigned, and it was a very surprising moment. And I learned this, and many don't know it, so I want to share it with you. So when a pope dies or resigns, every office in the Vatican more or less shuts down. At some point, the prefect and the superiors go away. Now, we still go in at my level, but there's nothing produced, no new documents, no new bishops named. It kind of just is on standstill. The only office in the Vatican that continues working as normal is the Apostolic Penitentiary, which is the office of the forgiveness of sins, because the church never stops the work of the forgiveness of sins. That's our church, and that's a beautiful thing. So that was something that inspired me that I learned.
Sir, go ahead, your question.
As I look at the panel, not counting you, Diane,
All right.
I see 5 people, 1 woman. And I wonder if all of you, from your various perspectives, might comment on the role of women both in the Holy See and here at Notre Dame. And from my standpoint, the standpoint of my St. Mary's wife, expanding the role of women.
So that question's for everybody. I don't know, Monsignor, if you want to just start us off and we can just pass the microphone on down.
Thank you. I'll just speak from the Holy See. I mean, I don't, not historically maybe, but I will say that, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a great presence of women working in the Holy See. I believe there's one now dicastery that has a woman that's in charge of the dicastery, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a presence there, and I'm encouraged by that. And I think Pope Francis is very, as was Pope Benedict, is very keen on that women certainly have a role. And I would say in the average parish, if you look around our country, certainly, the role of women is significant in the average parish in the church as lectors and teachers and catechists. So in my experience, both as a parish priest and also in the Vatican, I do see a very, very important role that's already taking place that women have in the church today.
My comment is, it's a shame that this panel is 20% female. It's a shame that in too many positions around the university, there is insignificant, insufficient diversity, gender diversity, but I could also include other kinds of diversity as well. I know it's an issue that Father Jenkins takes very seriously and is attentive to, and the university has initiatives seeking to address it. As a father of a daughter, I also think it's a shame. I do look around the university, and there is progress being made. Others can qualify that or expand upon that. But I do look at leading positions like the President's Chief of Staff, like the General Counsel, like numerous deans, that women are in those leadership roles. But Notre Dame and many other places surely do need to do better on this issue.
Thank you for your question. This is a subject I think about a lot and I teach about a lot. I teach a class here called Gender and Catholicism, and we speak about these issues. If I may, I'm just going to share one of my favorite moments in the papal coverage. It's about when I taught Chris Matthews something about women in the church. So Chris Matthews from Hardball, he was actually great. We were on live coverage together in Philadelphia. It was Chris Matthews and Bishop Robert Barron. He had just been appointed a bishop then. And I had, you prepare, going into this, you prepare different things that you're going to say, particularly if something goes wrong on the TV and you have to fill some airspace. But I was bound and determined going into the coverage in Philadelphia that if I could, I was going to try to bring Catherine Drexel into the conversation, a Philadelphia native. And about an hour before the Mass started at the cathedral in Philadelphia, we got the embargoed copies of Pope Francis's homily with instructions, he may change it, but it started out with telling the story of Catherine Drexel. And she founded a congregation of women religious. This is an heiress of the Philadelphia, prominent Philadelphia family who donated most of her family's vast fortune to the education of Native Americans and African Americans. And Chris Matthews had been on a bit of a tear about women in the church, about the Catholic Church just doesn't get it, and women, and he was going on and on and on about this. And so I was able to talk to him about the women like Catherine Drexel who have been leaders in the Catholic Church, and many, many more women like her. He said to me, after the homily, you can go as long as you want talking about Catherine Drexel, which again is not professor time, it's TV time, so it wasn't really as long as I wanted. But I was able to say, you know, Chris, this is not, because he was talking about the church as what he characterized as the woman problem. And I said, you know, you're basically describing every institution, every nation, every Fortune 500 company, every law firm, this is the ranks of women in leadership thin. The percentage of women thins the higher you go up in the leadership chain. And so he turned to me at one point and he said, well, look at you. You're an accomplished woman. Do you support the church's teaching on women's ordination? This is not the question you want to get on national TV. And I said, so this was my proud moment. I said, you know, that's really not a helpful or particularly interesting question to me, Chris. What is a much more interesting question is, does leadership in the church flow from the sacrament of ordination or from the sacrament of baptism? And the fact is that there are many, many women who are leading the church, but we don't know about them. There could be more. And so many, I heard Cardinal Tobin speak about this in the fall, that there are so many positions in the church that don't require ordination, that could be that women could be appointed, women who don't have, who can't perform sacraments. And I think that's what Pope Francis, where he is a supporter. He supported the first woman head of a pontifical university in Rome. He is bringing more women into the Vatican. So I think sometimes and I really did enjoy my time with Chris Matthews, but I think for some, they see, well, there's no women priests, or women can't be president of Notre Dame, and they stop there and they don't think about the other ways that women have been leading, and hopefully will continue to do so in other ways.
All right. Father Joan, you want to weigh in on that?
I don't know how much I can add to it. I would only say I was in high school 45 years ago, and the professional world was closed to women. Now there's hardly any profession that women are not doing, and doing very well. And the church is simply, you know, sometimes it's the train, sometimes it's the caboose, but it just moves along. So I'm encouraged. Things don't happen overnight anywhere, and in the church, never overnight. But look what's happened in 50 years just in society. Well, we're just moving in that direction, and I'm encouraged by that.
All right. John, do you want to weigh in on the role of women in the church?
Sure. I couldn't do better than what Kathy said. I'd actually like to offer a slightly different perspective, and that's that I think the issue of women in the church is just connected to the issue of lay people in the church. And my own situation was, I was on this commission. I was one of 4 lay people. There were 2 women. The prefect eventually, I think because of criticism, got the message that there should be more women on the commission. So there are more women, but what they did was just, they left the number of lay people at 4. So they replaced me with a woman and all the other laymen. But that's the issue of clericalism. And it's an issue that surprised me. Because in a sense, if you're working on one of these large commissions, there's a way in which you can't really advance the career of any of the priests, and they can't advance your career. I think 5 of the people on that commission became bishops. I was waiting. But it didn't happen, of course. But in a sense, that's a structural issue that's not going to be fixed by replacing laymen with lay women, because then laymen simply get to be the people who are not participating. So I think the issue of women in the church is partly of the issue of what is the role of lay people in the church. And so I'd offer that further observation.
Very good. I hope that whoever was standing over, please come to the microphone. Thank you for being patient.
This might be a quicker question. I think I speak for some other people when I say that I find many of the latest English translations of the liturgy to sound very tinny, and some of the phrases are really pedantic, almost as though they were English translations written by people who don't speak English. And I just wonder if there's a role for a university like Notre Dame to play in representing the English-speaking world, and perhaps, and maybe you disagree with me, but perhaps saying that, gosh, some of these new phrases we're supposed to say sound really odd in English.
Is there any one of you that wants to
A linguist
take that?
or an English professor?
I
John,
can say that
go for it.
just from my own experience, I'm also a consultant for the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Doctrine. I've been doing that since 2005, I think. And all these translations came before the Committee on Doctrine. Like, they also come before the Committee on Divine Worship to check for doctrinal errors. But many of us did have the opportunity to make comments about the style, and did. But what happens to those comments when it leaves our committee is not something we have any power over. But we did really.
You tried.
We did try.
Okay.
And I submitted extensive translations, which don't know really what happened to them, but our bishops, took them. And I feel as though I was listened to there.
Anybody else who wants to weigh in on that? Okay. Sir, you've been waiting patiently. What's your question?
I'm from Alumni Hall, so we are patient. We've been living next to Dylan forever. My question has to do more with, actually two of them. One is the opinion of the Holy See or the Vatican as it relates to the Catholic Church in the U.S. Where do we kind of fall in that, and the thoughts of that opinion? And secondly, what are the chances that we will get a U.S. Pope?
Wow. All right. Who would like to take that easy question? Monsignor, do you want to try that one?
I'll leave your second question to the Holy Spirit. The first question, the Vatican, the Holy See, doesn't have an official opinion, I don't think, on any particular country. I'll just say this from my personal experience from working where I worked in the Vatican. I think there's a real recognition that every country, every part of the world is different, how the faith is growing, what's happening, evangelization. There are really great signs of what's happening in our country. There are, down the south especially, churches are being built, schools being built, vocations are on the rise. So I would say, again, my personal experience was, I'll say it this way, so the ad limina visit is every 5 years, every bishop in the world comes to Rome for, the ad limina is Latin for to the threshold, and it's to the threshold of the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul. So the bishops actually come to Rome to pray to Peter for strength and faith, and pray to St. Paul for preaching. But also there are meetings, they meet with the Holy Father, and part of my job was to help arrange that for the United States back in 2011, 2012. And I was very proud when our country came of the challenges we face, certainly, but of the great signs of what is happening in our country for our faith and the great hope that we can have. And I think also, in general, the Holy See, all the congregations that met with the American bishops also sensed a real zeal, a real enthusiasm, and a very hopeful future for the church in our country.
Question.
Hi, my name's Kirsten Millard. I'm class of 2012. And this question is mostly, I think, for Professor Cummings and Mr. Lamphere about the collaboration between the Vatican Archives and Library and Notre Dame. I'm just, Professor Cummings, you mentioned the great resources there for research on the Church in America and some of the other projects and collaborations that are happening. So I wondered if you could expand on that and the other things that graduate students and professors are studying over there.
And thank you for that question. I kind of want to give everybody a warning that that probably was our last question. We've appreciated your input so much, but we want to give Kathleen and Chuck a chance to answer.
Thanks very much for that question. When, each generation of historians rewrites the past based on their own questions. And I think the generation of historians focused on the United States that came before me, the ones that taught me, really were shaped by American exceptionalism, that the United States story is so different than anywhere else in the world. And my beloved dissertation director and founder of the center I now direct, Jay Dolan, also talked about the Second Vatican Council and how he wanted to tell the history of the Catholic Church as the people in the pews. And he focused on immigrants, people who had come from Europe, from other places to come here. And I think in the generation that of historians that I'm part of, that idea of American exceptionalism no longer carries as much weight, and we live in a global world now. And the Catholic Church was non-Catholic, just described it, a very prominent non-Catholic, called the Catholic Church the world's most successful global institution. So what I try to do as a historian of the United States, so as I said, I teach classes called Catholics in America, things like that, but we really try to think about that many of the people that came to this country were not coming as immigrants per se, but were coming as missionaries. The United States was classified as missionary territory at the Holy See until 1908. That's a very long time. So many of the people, and the image, even though there wasn't the closeness that exists now between U.S. Catholics who now have influence at the Holy See, but there was still this relationship, and even for people who never saw the Pope or got to go to Rome, they still very much consider them part of that. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is, in recovering these archival sources, is that, or not recovering them, utilizing them, that if you're going to tell the history of the United States, of Catholics in the United States, you can't only be looking at sources within this nation's borders, that you necessarily have to think about what was Propaganda Fide, which is the Vatican dicastery that was in charge of mission territory that oversaw the United States. What were they saying about Americans? It often wasn't very nice what they were saying about Americans. They were very worried about many things, and they often didn't understand what was different about the United States. There were very few people that spoke English there, so there were a lot of people who went from the United States to try to explain what's happening. So that's something I try to do in my research, but also in my classroom a lot. We think about how it is, yes, the history of this country, but it's situated in a much broader history.
I'll point to just two kind of research projects which I think address your question. One's based out of the Vatican Library in Rome. Another is based at a center in Jerusalem that the university administers. And the thread that pulls them together is research, study, academic work that brings people together from different places. So either different geographic places, looking at the same text, looking at the same topic or question, or across religious grounds. So at the Vatican Library, we have a project that's just getting going right now that would take kind of Western scholars and Chinese scholars and look at topics that are interesting to both, coming at it from a different perspective, but studying together, coming to know each other through informal ways. And we think that there's real richness there to look, say, at the Silk Road, the path from Europe to China, from both a Western and an Eastern perspective, can lead to interesting intellectual things. Similarly, the University Center at the Tantor Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem is a Vatican-owned property that Notre Dame administers. Its sole purpose for being is to bring Christians of different denominations and Jews and Muslims as well, given where it is, together to study Scripture, to study theology, to study texts, but thereby breaking down some of the boundaries. And I think that's a project of the universities overall, that the pursuit of truth, pursuit of knowledge can bring us together. And that's an important project that the Holy See supports and that Notre Dame certainly supports as well.
Folks, thank you so much for your time. Don't go anywhere because we're going to be bringing Mike Sullivan back up here to have some final thoughts. But first off, I would like to thank all of our panelists from the bottom of my heart. What a great session we've had. You've been a great audience, and we thank you for spending your time with us for this Notre Dame Perspective session this morning. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks to all of you for your wonderful questions. Certainly added to the great dialogue that we had here with our panelists. We do want to offer our sincere apologies for the difficulty we had with the audio earlier in the program. And this last comment, I'm a little hesitant to say, but there are surveys, and if you would fill out those surveys, we sure would appreciate that. And one final note, there's a key female leader on campus who could not be with us here today, and that's the executive director of our Alumni Association, Dolly Duffy, who was out of town due to the death of her father. And I know Dolly would take great comfort in knowing that she has the prayers and condolences of the Notre Dame family. She'll be joining us tomorrow on campus, and if you know Dolly and have an opportunity to express your condolences, I'm sure she'd be very grateful. So again, thank you for being here with us today for ND Perspectives. We hope you have a great reunion weekend, and I'm sure we'll see you around campus. Thank you.